The one-sentence logline for Sound of Metal is really effective. A drummer in a metal band loses his hearing. That's just a great elevator pitch. It's simple, concise, and instantly paints a picture of character, conflict, and stakes. Anybody could hear that pitch and immediately go, oh, okay, yeah, I'm a simple man. I'm a sucker for great execution of a simple premise. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, just whatever story you're telling, tell the very best version of that story as possible. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better version of that simple drummer loses his hearing pitch than what we find in Sound of Metal. I think we can all agree, good premise, and I say, in this case, perfect execution. Riz Ahmed plays Ruben, the drummer in question. He's in a two-person band with his girlfriend Lou, played by Olivia Cook. They live together in an RV and sleep in parking lots as they go from city to city playing small shows. They're a hole-in-the-wall clubs and RV kind of band, not a packed stadiums and private jet kind of band. So you get the sense pretty quickly that this band and this relationship with Lou is pretty much Ruben's entire world. And then as they're setting up their merch table before show one night, suddenly Ruben's hearing just goes. It's not a dramatic accident or an exploding speaker or pyrotechnic gone wrong. He's just standing there having a conversation about the t-shirts they hope to sell that night, and suddenly he can't hear anymore. Ruben is immediately concerned with how this might affect their tour and their next album, but Lou has bigger concerns. We learn that Ruben is an addict in recovery, and Lou worries this sudden wrinkle in Ruben's stasis may threaten his sobriety. Ruben and Lou drive through the night to a facility that can meet his specific needs, a community for deaf addicts run by a man named Joe, played wonderfully by Paul Reese. And it's here we learn that Ruben has 4 years clean from heroin. And I want to point out that when Joe asks Ruben how long he's been clean, he says 4 years and holds up 4 fingers like that. And then like 30 seconds later, when Joe asks Ruben how long he and Lou have been together, he again answers 4 years and again holds up 4 fingers in the same way. I'm not saying it's a particularly difficult dot to connect, but him doing that gesture twice is as explicit as the movie gets in connecting Ruben's sobriety to his relationship with Lou. It doesn't spoon feed us any of this, but we're clearly meant to connect that dot. With that in mind, take a step back and really appreciate the stakes they're building here. Ruben loses his hearing, which puts his drumming and the band in jeopardy. And because the band is only him and Lou, the band in jeopardy means his relationship with Lou is in jeopardy. And because his sobriety from heroin is tied to his relationship with Lou, now his sobriety and therefore his whole life is in jeopardy. I mean, talk about stacking the deck against your main character. You thought that elevator pitch painted a clear picture of stakes. These are stakes. And I find it to be brilliant writing and character work. But the brilliant character work is not isolated to the page. The oft-praised and Oscar-nominated sound design, which simulates Ruben's hearing loss progression for the audience, is a super effective means of putting us in Ruben's shoes, or more accurately, in his head, and it helps us better understand what he's going through and helps us empathize with him. Also, when I watched this movie a second time, I noticed that for the first half of the movie, before Ruben knows American Sign Language, all of the signing is uncaptioned. And the second half of the movie, after Ruben learns ASL, all of the signing is captioned. So for any audience member who doesn't know ASL, you're lost when Ruben is lost, and you understand when Ruben understands. Again, a simple and effective way to help put the audience in Ruben's shoes. Another effective way the audience connects with Ruben is through Riz Ahmed's devastating performance. It's a very emotionally exhausting movie, and he's basically in every frame of it, so most of that considerable emotional weight is carried by his performance. It's wide-spanning. He basically goes through the 5 stages of grief when he loses his hearing. And because he's a metal drummer and has a bit of a punk rock attitude, there's a quiet rage simmering beneath everything he does. And that comes to the surface for the denial and anger stages of grief. But there's also a quiet sadness beneath everything he does too. Riz Ahmed has these big, expressive puppy dog eyes, and some of the more devastating moments of the movie are when Ruben is talking to a doctor getting not so great news, and the camera just holds on Riz Ahmed's face for 10 or 15 seconds as he processes what's happening to him. And you just want to give him a hug. While Riz Ahmed does go big with some of his angry scenes, most of his performance is in this subtle reaction realm. I already mentioned that the movie doesn't spoon-feed you the connection between Ruben's sobriety and his relationship with Lou, and instead trusts you to be able to connect that dot. And most of the storytelling has a similarly deft, subtle touch. For example, there's a shot or two in the first act that shows scars on Lu's arms, indicating that she has a history of self-harming. The scars aren't the focus of the shot by any means, they're just kinda incidental, and they're never directly addressed. Lu makes an oblique reference to hurting herself like 35 minutes later, and we learn in the third act that Lu dealt with some tumultuous family drama in the past and it likely affected her mental health. But these are mostly suggestions of a larger story happening just outside the frame. This movie happens to follow Ruben on his journey, but you get a sense that Lu is also having a movie-worthy journey that we're just not seeing. At the deaf community facility, Joe assigns jobs to all the residents/patients, and the job he assigns Ruben upon arrival is learn how to be deaf. Personally, I appreciate it when movies so explicitly tell you exactly what they're about, but taking a step back and looking at the totality of Ruben's journey and Lu's journey happening just outside the frame, you start to see that this movie isn't just about Ruben learning to be deaf. It's about codependency. When Ruben and Lu first get to the facility, Joe tells Ruben that in order to stay, he has to give up his car keys, fine. He has to give up his phone, okay. And also, Lu can't stay. And that doesn't fly for Ruben. When Joe says that, Ruben immediately gets up and says, thanks but no thanks. Being without Lu is the one thing he can't abide. And the entire time he's at the facility and learning how to be deaf, getting back to Lu is clearly his number one priority. The specific tasks that Joe gives Ruben while at the facility, they're built around stillness, and Ruben getting used to stillness, and Ruben getting used to sitting alone with his thoughts.
All I want you to do is just sit.
I see this as Joe helping Ruben become comfortable with being deaf, become comfortable with being sober, but mostly become comfortable with being alone. And not to give too much away, but later on we learn that Lu has probably been leaning on Ruben with her familial struggles as much as Ruben has been leaning on Lu with his addiction struggles. I'll say it a third time, the movie doesn't spoon feed you any of this, but if you read between the lines, you start to see how much this movie is about codependency. Ruben is convinced that what he needs is to get through his treatment, get back to Lu, and get his old life back, or as close to his old life as possible. But when you watch this, particularly given the final moments of the movie, ask yourself what Ruben really needs. I've always limited myself in these reviews to be spoiler-free, but I really wish I could talk more in depth about the ending. It's pretty open to interpretation, but I personally find it to be incredibly cathartic, and I think Riz Ahmed's performance in the ending is sublime. This may well be my favorite performance of the year, and what may well be my second favorite performance of the year is Paul Raci as Joe. He's just such a calming presence. Ruben comes to Joe completely in crisis, but every time Paul Raci's on screen, you just feel safe and feel like everything's gonna be okay. I said the movie is emotionally exhausting, and that's because Ruben's emotionally all over the place, but Joe, on the other hand, is the warm center of calm, marvelously empathetic and wise. Sound of Metal is definitely one of my favorite movies of the year, possibly even my favorite. It has wonderful performances of complex characters, deft and subtle filmmaking, and not for nothing, it made me reflect on the nature of disability. The late academic Mike Oliver coined the phrase social model of disability, which basically posits that the concept of disability has less to do with the individual and what they can or can't do, and more to do with the societal structures that can or can't accommodate the needs of the individual. It's not a problem with a person, it's a problem with society. I certainly think Joe would agree with this theory, and if you asked Ruben his thoughts, his answer would differ depending on when in the movie you asked him. When Ruben starts to go deaf, he panics and thinks, how do I fix this? He then spends the entire movie fixing himself, but not in ways that have anything to do with his hearing.